I just, the Prince thing, I lived through this. It never, like, like, it was sort of always in the background. Like, he changed his name. I just assumed, oh, he just did that because he's trying to be wacky. But that wasn't it at all. We're talking, of course, about the musician. Let's just start there, just because I was like, I was like, oh my God, why didn't I ever even contemplate why he done this? But walk us through, like, why Prince changed his name as an example of what is now, I think, much more even widespread than it was then.
Yeah, and I'm going to try and do this without getting into too much eye-watering detail. The book that we wrote, Chokepoint Capitalism, we kind of spend the first half unpicking these very Baroque scams, where kind of John Oliver style dissection of these different kinds of accounting frauds. And the record industry is rife with them. It's the point of going through all of these is to realize that they're not hard to understand because they're complicated. They're complicated precisely so that they'll be hard to understand. So the record industry has long been a source of very bad contracting terms for artists. And part of our thesis in the book is that it doesn't really matter how much copyright you give to artists if there's only a couple of labels and if they demand that you just turn over all that copyright to sign to them. And Prince is a very good example of that. So just as with most other artists, Prince had to sign away all of his rights to sign up with the label. And he had to finance the production of his own music. When you sign a deal with the label, you get an advance that's supposed to pay for your rent, your groceries while you're recording. And then you also have charged to your account all the expenses associated with that recording. So they tell you what studio to use and what engineers and what sidemen, and they charge you for all of that, often at rates that they get to determine and often rates that are much higher than market rate. And then you start earning it back. And you earn it back in the form of royalties, and the royalties are extraordinarily low. They were better for Prince than they were for, say, the Beatles, who got 1 penny per LP that they split 4 ways, minus 15% for breakage and 10% for their manager. But they were still extremely low. And what that meant is that Prince could make millions and millions of dollars for the labels and still owe hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions for his production. What's more, Prince had recorded a lot more music than the labels would allow him to put out. And so he couldn't even earn back the money that he had paid in, and they had a lock on his masters. And so he painted
I just want to tease that part out here so that people understand what that means. So he's going into the studio, he's pumping out, recording them. The studio doesn't want to use them on the album, but they're still charging him for producing them. So they're not allowing him, A, the ability to make money off of those things that he's paid for, and B, from an artistic standpoint, he wants to release, he can't release them. And so it's just having gone down there and done that extra work essentially cost him money, and he didn't even get the artistic, he didn't even get any artistic value out of it.
Yeah, so the labels, back in those days before we had streaming digital music, the labels really wanted to control how much music there was. There were these physical limitations to how much music you could sell that were in the form of record bins and CD bins at the record store and the space they had at the warehouse. And they just wanted to time the tempo of releases so that they could manage and maximize their return from all of this stuff. And Prince was an extraordinarily prolific guy, a brilliant and talented musician. And, he wanted to release more than he had. Now, it's interesting because when digital came along, not only did it free us from some of that tyranny of physical space, but more importantly, provided a competitive hedge against the labels. That when digital came along, the labels started paying more royalties. They started cleaning up their worst accounting practices. Some of that was actually due to some legal changes. So after the Enron meltdown, we got Sarbanes-Oxley. And Sarbanes-Oxley established criminal penalties for corporate executives who signed fraudulent accounting forms. And so before that, it had been a common practice to run an off-the-books third shift at the CD pressing plants, where they would press another round of CDs that would just never show up in your royalty statements, and they could sell those without giving you any of that money. And after Sarbanes-Oxley created criminal liability, personal criminal liability, jail time for executives who signed off on those statements, that practice ended. But, as the tech sector became much more consolidated and started to look a lot more like the record industry, the two became really indistinguishable. It's like that last scene from Animal House where you look from the pig, or not Animal House, Animal Farm, where you look from the pigs to the men and the men to the pigs, and you can't tell the difference. And that, really reaches its apotheosis with Spotify, which is a tech company that's owned in significant measure by the record labels. And so it's the fusion of tech and entertainment, and they use all the tricks that tech has and all the tricks that entertainment has to screw over the creative workforce that produces the value for them.
Has it gotten worse? I mean, because having had been in show business at one time, and aware, particularly in the context of like movies, it was much harder for them to do this with TV. But for some reason, it was much easier for them to do it in movies because there was a lot more sort of like places they could spend money on marketing. But it always feels like you get residuals or any type of like back end on any of these things. By the time they're done accounting, no movie seems to have ever made a profit.
Well, in some ways, this is just like a reflection of a phenomenon that's happening all over the world. So every sector has become super concentrated. There's 2 companies that make all the athletic shoes and 3 companies that do all the shipping, and all your beer comes from 2 companies, and, 1 company makes all the eyeglasses in the world. So this is true also in the entertainment sector. And wherever you see these monopolies, you also get what economists call monopsony, which is a difficult word, but an easy concept. A monopoly is when you've got one seller for a good, and a monopsony is when you've got one buyer. Monopsonies are particularly bad for labor because you are selling your labor. And so if there's only one buyer for your labor, then that buyer can set terms. And in the entertainment industry, there are so many choke points that these monopsonies have created that wherever you turn, there's someone sticking their hands in your pockets. So we tell a story in our book about the Writers Guild here in California, in Hollywood, that ground out a 22-month strike against the talent agencies. All the talent agencies have been rolled up into 4 giant firms, 2 of them owned by private equity companies. And they restructured the standard deal so that instead of taking 10% of what the writer got from their negotiated contract, they started to take a packaging fee from the studios. So they said, we're not going to take a commission out of the writer. We're going to package the writer, the actor, and the director all together for a single project, and we will get a fee out of the studio. And the less money they accepted for the talent, the bigger that fee would be. And in the golden age of television, when you had all this like high budget Netflix and other streaming TV coming out, the income for writers shrank to the point where some writers discovered that their agents were getting 90% and they were getting 10%. And the agencies were starting to set up their own studios. So they were going to negotiate with themselves on behalf of their writers. The writers gave the agencies 7 days to clean up their act, to sign a code of conduct. And the agencies, all 4 of them, refused. And then on one day, all 7,000 writers in the Writers Guild fired their agents and grounded a 22-month strike that culminated with the absolute capitulation of all 4 of the big talent agencies. And, that story appears in the second half of the book, where we address ourselves to solutions to this problem. And it's not the kind of individual solutions that you get in those chapter 11 books. It's like 10 chapters of how things are screwed up and 11th chapter about how you can vote harder.
Right.
It's detailed, technical, systemic proposals. Labor unions, changes in contracting law, changes in competition law, changes in our tech law that will make sure that the distributional outcomes of entertainment labor markets result in creators getting more money for their labor. Not just more copyright, but more money to pay their rent, more money to pay for their groceries, more money to put braces on their kids' teeth.